Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Welcome, everyone. It's been a while since we have continued in this book, After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy. And so we're going to continue in chapter 2, titled, Bigamy, Sir, is a Crime. If only, observes Pascal, in one of his penetrating pensies, Cleopatra's nose had been a fraction shorter, the course of world history would have been altered. An equally plausible, though less edifying supposition is that if only Philip the Magnanimous of Hesse had followed the current practice of taking a concubine and not married a second wife, the Reformation might have swept irresistibly through the whole of Germany, and possibly even Central Europe as well. As it was, the Landgrave, to use his German title, felt impelled by his reverence for the sacraments to mend his first marriage by contracting a second one, even while his wife was alive. And he did so with the sanction of the fathers of the Reformation. The first paladin of German Protestantism, notes the scholarly Rockwell in the opening page of his book on Philip's bigamy, was, with Luther and Melanchthon's permission, a bigamist. Reader's note here. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce this Melanchthon. I'll have to look that up, but it's kind of an interesting word there. Continuing on, Protestant historians have never recovered from the shock. One of Luther's biographers denounced the step as the greatest stain on his reputation and indeed on the Reformation. Other writers have sought to shift the blame to the unfortunate Landgrave. Philip indignantly denied that he was at fault, and it is difficult not to feel some sympathy for him. At the youthful age of 16, before he knew what he was doing, he was railroaded into an engagement with Christina, the daughter of the Duke of George of Saxony of the House of Meissen. She had given him 6 children, some historians say 7, at the time of his bigamous marriage. Nevertheless, says Rockwell with professional candor, Philip was dissatisfied with his wife. The reasons for his unhappiness are not far to seek. Christina was desperately plain. She drank and stank and had unpleasant, if unspecified, habits. Little wonder that Philip never felt love or desire for her. His revulsion must have been intense, for he describes himself as having a strong constitution, and he is credited with the possession of 3 testicles and a correspondingly powerful sex drive. He stuck it out for 3 weeks and thereafter settled down to a steady diet of fornication and adultery, seasoned with occasional bouts of homosexuality. At the assemblies of the German princes, he was particularly exposed to the temptations of the flesh during the long sessions of riotous carousing. As Philip put it to the Lutheran preachers, how could he, in all fairness, avoid sin when he could not always take a large harem along with him? It was not that he lacked a moral sense. He was a God-fearing prince, well-versed in the Bible, well enough to know that, according to St. Paul, adulterers and fornicators would never enter the kingdom of heaven, so that if he died in battle, the devil would carry him off to eternal damnation. He was constantly being urged by his spiritual advisors to suppress immorality, but how could he punish offenders when he was himself guilty of the sin? His feeling of guilt was such that soon after his marriage, in 1523, he consistently refrained from observing communion. Although he longed to partake of it, his pangs of conscience rose to a paroxysm in 1539, when, like so many of his illustrious contemporaries, he had a serious attack of syphilis. Obviously, he felt a punishment from on high for his excesses. His sufferings, both physical and spiritual, became intolerable. What was the remedy? Divorce was out of the question, both on legal and political grounds. However, if he could not repudiate Christina, could he not marry another, more attractive wife and thus escape from the toils of Satan? He had long and openly proclaimed his belief that it was not an offense in Yahweh's eyes or God's eyes to have 2 wives, and he was encouraged in this view by some of the court preachers. His interest in bigamy revived, and it became intense when he suddenly fell in love with a beautiful 17-year-old girl called Margaret von der Sale, a lady-in-waiting to his sister Elizabeth, wife of Duke Henry of the House of Dresden. However, it takes two to make a marriage, especially a bigamous one. Philip realized that the struggle would be a hard one, and he prepared for it with the meticulous but daring generalship that he brought to his strategic campaigns. The girl, or rather her widowed mother, Anna, had to be put one round. And Anna had very clear ideas as to what she wanted. Ambition, reinforced by respect for conventional morality, enabled her to put formidable pressure on the prince. She was not prepared to let her daughter become Philip's concubine, or even by a secret bigamous marriage, to be put in a position which suggested as much. Initially, therefore, the most that she would concede was that Margaret would be preempted for the Landgrave for 3 years. If Christina died within this waiting period, Margaret would be his. And she sweetened her semi-refusal by permitting Philip to visit her daughter in the family house as often as he wished. Philip was not discouraged. Gradually, he wore down the mother's resistance. His first victory was to obtain her agreement to a bigamous marriage if its legitimacy was openly defended and if others were allowed to follow the prince's example, that is, if bigamy were made generally publicly permissible. This demand was at once rejected, but Philip kept up the pressure, and in the end, Anna yielded for the ground. She now accepted that the marriage be kept secret, but she held out for the attendance at it of state and church dignitaries. Her list of prospective wedding guests is impressive. It includes Johann Friedrich, the Elector of Saxony, some of Philip's senior counselors, his wife Christina, she herself, of course, her brother Ernest von Miltitz, and on the clerical side, Luther, Melanchthon, and Bucer, and three leading figures in the German Reformation, or at the very least two of them. However, in the end, she relented to some extent. If the elector and the duke were unable to attend, their delegates would do. The Landgrave was not daunted by these exacting terms. From Augsburg, still in 1539, he summoned one of his most trusted agents, a certain Dr. Saylor, who then spent 3 months at Philip's court. During his stay, he was introduced to try to persuade Bucer, an eminent theologian and an old friend and advisor of the Landgrave, to act as intermediary in the delicate task of obtaining the support of his fellow reformers, Luther and Melanchthon, and of the elector. And in the November, Saylor set out for Strasbourg, where Bucer was then settled. When he learned that Philip was planning to commit bigamy, Bucer was utterly horrified. He feared the devastating effect of such novelties, i.e., radical doctrines, on the weaker brethren in the Reformation, and hesitated to commit himself. Thereupon Saylor played his trump card. Was Bucer prepared to stand by and see the Landgrave, the captain of the Protestant forces, make his peace with the Catholic faction, as he would undoubtedly do if he were refused the moral backing that he was requesting? Rather than see the whole movement come crashing down in ruin, Bucer accepted the invitation to broach the question of bigamy to the reformers. By the end of November, he was at the Landgrave's castle at Menselgen, where he was treated to an uninhibited and exhaustive confession by the prince of all his variegated sins, his physical sufferings and deprivations, and his obsessive angst about damnation. Under his massive assault, Bucer's last scruples crumbled. To buttress him for the encounter with Luther, he was given a detailed brief on Philip's request, which, it was carefully underlined, was a modest one, covering only one additional wife. What was wanted, ran the instructions to the reformer, was a written testimony that the prince would not be committed an offense against Elohim if he contracted with such a marriage. The ceremony would be secret, but Luther and Melanchthon were requested to spy out a way to make it public at some later date. The issue was raised in general terms. Marguerite's name was never mentioned in the discussion, and indeed Bucer was probably unaware that the Landgrave had already made his choice of a second wife. This silence on Philip's part was frequently been trounced as disingenuous, both at the time and later, as if the principle involved was of secondary importance and the morality of otherwise bigamy depended on the identity of his fiancée and the date of his marriage to her. On any reasoning, Philip's tactics were justified. He saw no ground for bringing Marguerite into the picture until the obstacles to his union with her was removed. However, he could he can have little doubt about his plans would succeed, for early in the November, Sailor had been instructed to order the wine for the wedding and to observe the most scrupulous discretion in making the purchase. If it is doubtful if Bucer felt the same confidence as his master. However, armed with his brief, he set out on a journey and arrived on the 9th of December in Wittenberg, where he immediately submitted to the Landgrave's suit to the other two reformers. They were horrified. They realized at once the unbounded offense which such a bigamous marriage would cause. The reaction among the Protestants would be one of utter dismay, especially when it came to the womenfolk. Bucer was himself later to write, "It must be most painful above all for women to hear of this marriage. Of all the thousands of pious and kindly women, there will not be a single one whom the news will not stab in the heart." And if this was the effect of one marriage, there would be a cataclysm if the example were followed and a tidal wave of monsterite polygamy surged across Germany. The prospect was by no means fanciful. Some 2 years later, Bucer foresaw that the publication, with Philip's endorsement, of a work in favor of polygamy would, quote, raise up a new sect of wild fanatics, unquote. People would imagine that Philip's bigamy would be initiated or imitated with impunity, even as Luther was to put it by the veriest clodhopper. But it was not only from the masses that danger threatened. Another Protestant divine was to issue the solemn warning that many of the men of the highest rank shared Philip's views, and he feared, therefore, quote, a violent bloody war if this evil or this untimely madness was impudently fanned. If dissension would burn into flame within the Protestant camp, danger from the enemy was equally serious. In the early 1520s, the Pope had instructed his legate to the Diet of Worms to represent the Protestant doctrine as pernicious because it favored polygamy. And Sir Thomas More had used the same gambit at his defense of Henry VIII against the Lutherans' attack in the days before he broke with Rome. Lastly, and more immediately, the Reformation might, as already shown, be hamstrung if Philip defected to the side of the emperor, as he openly threatened to do if the reformers were obstinate in giving him their approval. And this approval Philip was determined to have, for it both enabled Philip to secure Anna's consent to the marriage, defend his actions if it would be an open clash, and perhaps most important of all, give him some protection against the emperor. Bigamy had been made a capital offense in 1532. If, therefore, the marriage became public, Philip could be tried and sentenced by his overlord. The Holy Roman Empire might, as Voltaire put it in a famous joke, be neither Holy Roman nor an empire. But it was still the greatest power in Europe, and Charles V, the ruling emperor, was the master of Spain and the Austrian dominions, lord of the German principalities, and a brilliant statesman and strategist. In this delicate situation, Luther and Melanchthon found themselves between the devil of Philip's pressure and the deep sea of potential Protestant disintegration. For 2 years, they wrestled with the intricacies of the problem and with their consciousness, and on the second, they set their signatures, jointly with Bucer, to a document which is unique in European history, the Wittenberg Deliberation. It bears the scars of the travail that attended its birth. Much of it is taken up with an examination of the biblical authority for polygamy, and there's a long homily on the virtues of chastity, which quotes the dictum of the Albanian hero Skanderbeg, to the effect that nothing weakens a warrior's strength so much as indulgence. But the nub of the matter lies in 3 relatively short passages. The first, inserted by Melanchthon, stresses the danger that if Philip were to take a second wife, the enemies of the gospel would lump the Protestants together with the polygamous Turks and wild Munsterites. The second warns against the temptation of many of the faithful to follow Philip's example in an age when, to a far greater extent than nowadays, the acts of princes caused more of a stir than those of his subjects. Hence, if the common people saw, quote, a prince take another wife, they would claim to be allowed similar latitude. However, if Philip was bent on marrying again, they were well aware that that there was no alternative. They were being forced at gunpoint to pronounce and had to come off the fence. Bucer was pressing to be allowed to go back, and they could not let him leave without an answer, and so they agreed with obvious distaste in a third and conclusive passage that they would not object, provided the marriage was kept strictly secret. And so they wrote, "You have our written testimony in the case of need." Having overcome the first hurdle, the Landgrave's ambassador was set off on the next leg of his whirlwind tour. On the 15th of December, he was received by the Elector of Saxony, Johann Friedrich. Bucer's mission to the prince was facilitated by the grant of the deliberation and possibly even more by the assurance from Philip that he would back the elector for emperor if the war of religion were to break out and the Protestants were to defeat the Catholics. And thus, he able to nominate an emperor of their own faith. Even though sweetened by such assurances, the news staggered the Saxon ruler. His reply was studiously cautious. It repeatedly urged the Landgrave to desist from his plans. If, however, his resolve was unalterable, he should observe the strictest secrecy, and the message ended with vague and diplomatic professions of friendliness and offers of help. Philip himself had not been inactive. On the 11th of December, he obtained the consent of his wife by promising that her children would be the sole heirs to the throne, and assurance that may have been appreciated even more that he would show her more and not less kindness than before through sleeping with her and through other actions befitting married people. Having secured the approval, or at least the complicity of the main persons involved, he was now ready to lay siege to Anna. After Bucer had reported on his mission, the Landgrave dispatched two messengers to her on the 23rd of December with copies of all the various dispensations and agreements. On the 12th of January, 1540, the messengers returned, but without the unequivocal reply which Philip had expected. Anna had not only maintained her previous demands, but had actually added new ones. She now insisted that Christina should issue an invitation to her for the wedding. It appears that the Landgrave ignored this proposal, but he confirmed his agreement to all the other terms, with the exception of to suggest invitation to Ernst von Miltitz, Anna's brother, on the grounds that, quote, as a papist, he was not sufficiently well versed in the scriptures to grasp the legitimacy of the second marriage. Reader's note, very interesting comment, isn't it, that papists or Catholics, which I think that's something that we also have found, they don't know their scriptures because they're following nothing more than traditions of men, and they're following the counsels of the priests and the Pope. That's an interesting comment, isn't it? That generally Catholics, by and large, simply do not even know their own scriptures. For the rest, he now regarded the wedding as certain, for the first time revealed to a few chosen counselors the identity of his fiancée. His court preachers thereupon appended their names to the Wittenberg deliberation, and on the 18th of January he obtained a further clearance from his wife. Far from being taken aback on learning of his plans for Marguerite, Christina, at least so the Landgrave alleges, was even more agreeable to his plans than when they had been put to her in general terms. Everything then was ready for the ceremony. But what of the bride herself? Hitherto Marguerite had received Philip's attentions passively without pleasure or aversion. She may not even have known of his attentions, since the Landgrave had not confided in her. Through her mother had probably given her some inkling of what was afoot. What was more, Marguerite was not on good terms with her mother, and might not have taken kindly to the engagements entered into by Anna on her behalf. Philip was therefore afraid that at the last moment the girl might jettison the understanding and try to escape to her friends and relatives. Indeed, he had laid plans to counter any such move by producing Marguerite's letters, however innocuous, and thus spoil her marriage prospects. But his fears proved groundless. Marguerite showed herself happy at her fate. By mid-February, she had moved from Dresden to her mother's estate, and on the 4th of March, the marriage took place at a small town of Rothenburg in der Fulda. Philip kept his word as to the invitations. The elector in the house of Meissen sent representatives, and Bucer and Melanchthon arrived as well. Strangely enough, the reformers did not seem to have not been told whom Philip was marrying until they entered the church. Let me read that again. Strangely enough, the reformers did not seem to have been told whom Philip was marrying until they entered the church. Philip's Written instructions also dated the 4th of March to Melander and Lenning, two of his preachers, as to what they were to tell their colleagues. Do not mention Marguerite, but refer to her as, quote, a person who is now disposed to take me in marriage, unquote. The brief is also revealing as to the preoccupations uppermost in the Landgrave's mind. Quote, it is vital, unquote, says the note, that the reformers and his own counselors be present to bear witness that he plans, quote, a marriage and not whoremongering, unquote. The reformers are urged never to use the word concubine, since that usually refers to a whore. Readers note, actually, that doesn't refer to a whore in the biblical sense. It is simply a wife of lesser estate. Continuing on, Philip must have a wife whom he likes, since he means to retain his first wife. Should Christina die, he plans to keep his second wife as his only one, thus returning to the monogamous fold. Hence, she cannot be a person of lowly rank, such as a peasant girl. And he concludes with a statement of what he will say if asked by the guest about the reasons for his marriage. It is intended as a medicine and remedy for evil conduct and dissolute living, and it will help him to lead a better, more Christian life. The Landgrave's instructions were faithfully followed by Melander, as the wedding certificate testifies, after paying tribute with the starched pomp of the times to, quote, our most mightily, most invincible, and most gracious Emperor Charles V, unquote. The document records the presence of His Highness Prince and Lord Philip Landgrave, Count of Katzelbogen, Dietz, Ziegenhain, and Nida, with certain counselors of His Highness on the one hand, and the honorable and virtuous maiden Marguerite von der Sale, and certain relatives on the other. Melander then explained that Philip wished to marry Marguerite, although His Highness's first wife was still alive. In order, however, the address continued, quote, that this step is not decreed as capricious or frivolous, and no offense be caused hereby, in the good name of the said maiden and her honorable relatives be not jeopardized. His Highness swears before Elohim, or God, that it is motivated by important and unavoidable considerations of conscience and body, and that it is impossible for him to be saved unless he take a second wife in addition to the first one, unquote. Readers note, that's very interesting, because that is an interesting reasoning that perhaps would apply to so many Christian men today, in marriages that they are quite unhappy about, or perhaps they meet a single woman and they fall in love with her, and it is so much better, the reasoning being that they should take her in proper standing according to Scripture, rather than take her as, perhaps basically fornicate with her and not make commitment to her, you see, which is the standard. In fact, I remember recently there was a very famous preacher who, we don't know the depth to the relationship that he had with this young lady, but brought such disrepute upon him because of the false monogamy-only doctrine that he had to step down from a very prestigious teaching position, simply because society misunderstands the import of these principles. Continuing on, the marriage was a quiet one, since in our times it is unusual to have two wives at the same time, although in the present case it is licit and Christian, unquote. Isn't that interesting? Thereupon the couple, joined in marriage by the preacher, swore undying love and troth to each other. The following day Melanchthon himself then urged the prince, as thanks for the dispensation granted, to take better care of the Lutheran clergy and teachers in church schools, and to abstain from fornication, adultery, and boys. Readers note, isn't that interesting, the level of sins that this Landgrave was apt to engage in? Pedastry, very a heinous sin. No wonder he was fearful of hell, as he should be. The Landgrave was so overjoyed that he took little notice of such exhortations. Far from being plagued with multiple scruples, he was proud of his action. Quote, I have done it, unquote. He was a fortnight later, quote, with God and good conscience, unquote. And on the 5th of April, he wrote to Luther, thanking him for the dispensation and telling him that he had taken Easter communion, quote, with a merry conscience, unquote, and would, as a result, be able to further the cause of the Reformation with great zeal. He added the piquant detail that Marguerite had turned out to be a relative of the great theologian's wife, and hence to his delight he was Luther's brother-in-law. He was convinced of the legitimacy of his marriage, but what answer should he give if he were asked point blank about it? Luther replied immediately that the bigamy should be kept secret because of the bad example it might set. Now, readers note, interesting that Luther was had such trepidation about even acknowledging it in public because, this movement was new. It was up and coming, and the Catholics had a very powerful force set in years of such. Continuing on, but it was too much to expect that all those in the know would be discreet. Some of them even had an interest in provoking a scandal. Nor some of the Landgrave's friends all. Okay, let me read that again. Nor did the Landgrave's friends all help. In April, the court preacher Melander was foolish enough to defend bigamy from the pulpit, and the feverish building work on Marguerite's new residence in the country set tongues wagging. By the 25th of May, another court divine was writing in anguished tones to the prince that a terrible rumor was all over the land. It was likely to cause widespread defection from the gospel. A country parson, he added, had even asserted that Luther's permission to celebrate the marriage had been bought at the cost of a cask of wine. The tale soon reached the ear of the Duke Henry of Dresden. He was the husband of Elizabeth, Philip's sister, and Elizabeth herself was Marguerite's mistress. Henry realized that it would be automatically assumed that he and his wife were a party to the marriage, and he determined to get to the bottom of the reports. It was not hard for him. Anna van der Sale was one of his subjects. On the last day of May, she was fetched to court by a posse of cavalry and forced to make confession. The next day, she was escorted back to her estate, together with two secretaries, and obliged to deliver up the documents in her possession for copying. As it happened, she surrendered only Philip's declaration to his wife of the 11th of December and long document by Bucer, setting out his views for and against polygamy. In the confusion, this had been substituted for the Wittenberg deliberation. The story soon made the rounds in Germany and beyond. Preachers fell to denouncing Philip for his lapse from grace. Other reactions were of unbelieving hilarity. Had one even heard of anything so silly? Asked the Margrave of Brandenburg. The emperor himself, who had sired children all over Europe and then had them legitimized by the Pope, felt that it was all a huge joke, but one that could be turned to solid political advantage. And in France, there was a ribald Gallic laughter. More serious men were profoundly disturbed. Ferdinand, who was to succeed Charles V as emperor, is said to have been defected by the scandal from turning Protestant. Readers know. Interesting. So this, of course, is what Luther feared, that these principalities, these powerful men, these lords, rulers in Europe at that time, would defect, and, because they were so worried about the reputation of the Protestant movement, they didn't want to be associated with it, which is something perhaps that even people, men who are of good and moral import, who take this upon themselves, they suffer this lack of reputation themselves. Continuing on. The men who had granted Philip his secret dispensation were on tenterhooks and hastily looked to their defense. Luther wrote to the elector that he had been misled by the Landgrave. He had thought Philip had meant to take only a simple girl who would be kept in a quiet spot out of the harms and gossip's way. But the princess, it now turns out, had married a lady-in-waiting, no less, who had been set up in an imposing country residence. The moral issues appeared to be of less concern to Luther than the social ones, and indeed, to judge by his table talk, that's in 1540, at the time, he saw the only hope of salvation in the possibility that, who could say, Marguerite might soon die. Melanchthon, for his part, readers note, I wonder why he might suggest that, perhaps because the Landgrave, this lord, had syphilis, and perhaps being that it would transfer to her. It's interesting that this woman was willing to engage in such, knowing that the dangers of such, or maybe she was too ignorant to even know the dangers. Who can say? Continuing on, Melanchthon, for his part, tried to beat a retreat and delivered himself a revised and unfavorable pronouncement on the marriage. Thereupon, under the weight of the mounting evils springing up all around him, he prayed to God, quote, to avert the monstrous danger and scandal, unquote, and broke down. For days he was unable to touch food or drink and hovered between life and death. He only rallied when Luther rode out to breathe confidence into him with the power of his robust faith. The elector was equally concerned, He had only agreed to the marriage with the utmost hesitation and on the express condition that it was kept strictly secret. He now sent Philip a letter full of veiled reproaches for having caused Melanchthon's collapse, an accusation which Philip heatedly rejected. There was, of course, no question of Saxon support for the Landgrave's position now that the bigamy was the stock subject of conversation in Germany. The common factor in all of these reactions was an insistence on the need to keep this gigantic skeleton in its cupboard. Philip, on the contrary, was perfectly prepared to drag it out in the light of day. From the start, as his instructions to Bucer show, he had been eager to have the marriage recognized by all and sundry, and not kept as a subject for snickering whispers or open denunciation. The subject distinctly, the subtle distinction drawn by Luther between what was right in God's eyes and what could be defended to the world seemed to him the flimsiest of casuistries. I think that word is casuistries, kind of like causal. He may have been the founder of the great University of Marburg, but he was essentially a bluff military man, more at home at the battlefield or with his hunting dogs than with, quote, the sapient sutlers of the Lord. In other words, readers know. In other words, this describes this man as sort of a simple man, but he was a very straightforward moral man, you see. But he did not understand the intrigues and the subtleties of the doctrinal arguments involved. I think that's what's being communicated here. Continuing on. He had clear, straightforward ideas, and he stuck to them with laudable tenacity. For him, what was right, and he was prepared to defend his convictions even at the cost of political eclipse. Rather than see his marriage questioned, he would be content to retire to a house or two, doubtless for his two establishments, and hand over his estate to his children or the emperor. He was not disturbed by the prospect of opposition. Quote, from the world, unquote, he wrote to Luther. Quote, we do not count an exhorting recognition of Marguerite, unquote. Or we do not count on exhorting recognition of Marguerite, unquote. In other words, readers know, is that Philip Landgrave felt that this was sort of a compromise of sorts, and he did not expect other people to accept his marriage, but he was holding to it very steadfastly himself, and felt himself very justified, and perhaps rightly so, given that the Protestants, leaders had given him license to do so. Continuing on. He felt that his position on the score was by no means weak. It was an age when marriage was in state of flux. Priests had forsworn celibacy and taken wives to themselves on turning Lutheran, but Catholics still regarded such unions as invalid and sacrilegious. Readers note, well, of course, because the Catholic Church not only had the heresy of forbidding polygamous marriage as just and righteous as the Bible describes, but they also had the heresy of celibacy in the priesthood, which is considered a doctrine of demons, if you remember, according to the New Testament instructions. Continuing on, other radical innovations such as bigamy would naturally meet with similar condemnations, at least start with. But this did not make them any less justifiable than priestly marriage. Luther, the ex-monk married to an ex-nun, need therefore not to be so self-righteous, and in the same letter just quoted, Philip, after affirming that he considers Marguerite his wife by God's word and Luther's advice, administers a savage thrust at the reformer. Quote, God grant that the world may so regard the wives of our preachers in this and other lands, unquote. Nor was it merely a question of Philip's own marriage. The relief afforded him should be granted to others as well. To Bucer he wrote acidly that he would not dispute whether bigamy was sinful or not, or whether it was formerly a general usage, quote, for we leave to you, the learned, in your superior wisdom, unquote. But, he noted pointedly, quote, if anyone falls into the same difficulty, we would not hesitate to countenance a similar remission in his case, unquote. Though he qualified his threat by making the marriage conditional on the approval of the man's confessor, the state authorities, and if pressed, the freely given consent of the first wife as well. This is reader's note here. It's interesting that that this situation is such that he said that he would even allow others in his kingdom to engage in similar practice if they were found in similar unfortunate situation. Continuing on, strong in the assurance of the justice of his case, Philip even assembled his notables on the 2nd of June at Kassel and tried to induce them to back his stand. He was unsuccessful. His advisers were well aware that such a course would provoke a violent intervention by the emperor. They therefore suggested a more diplomatic line. The Landgrave should admit to having a concubine, but quibble as to the meaning of the word. The public would take it as synonymous with a mistress, whereas Philip would understand it in the biblical sense of an additional wife, a helpmeet before the Lord, such as those taken by Abraham, David, and other holy men. Very reluctantly, the Landgrave agreed, for he had always heartily disliked the immoral associations of the word suggested. Reader's note here, and I can understand that because the term concubine really is an unfortunate term. I've always preferred the term covenant handmaid, but because of the English language as such as it is unfortunate that it is associated with whoredom. And this is, of course, the problem of the ignorance of the common people. I mean, they simply don't know the nuances of Scripture or the law. Remember, these were very simple common people. And remember that they were in the Middle Ages or out of the Middle Ages, at the beginning of the Enlightenment, I think, around 1500 when the Protestant Reformation began to pick up steam. You have to also understand that the people were not accustomed to studious application of themselves to the Scriptures because they had come out of Catholicism, where it was therefore forbidden for men, and especially women, to engage in the study of the Scriptures. It was strictly reserved unto a priesthood class and held jealously by the Catholics, and they could do whatever they wanted with them. They could say this or that, and if it lined up with the Scriptures, fine. If it didn't, no one would know the better. And so, continuing on. However, the reformers felt that even this concession was not enough to save the situation. They were particularly apprehensive of the danger of a general challenge for bigamy. Bucer repeatedly urged the Landgrave to tell a deliberate holy lie when asked about the rumors, and quoted Scripture in support of his views. Had not Abraham deceived his host when he asked about Sarah? And did not even God himself mislead his enemies by visions and illusions? Readers note, that's an interesting line of argument there, isn't it? Unquote. Bucer even suggested that Philip should revise the marriage contract to make Marguerite a concubine, though continuing to treat her as a wife. And he made other improving proposals, such as that Philip should devote less time to hunting and other amusements and more matters of state and to his wife. The Landgrave, to be fair, heeded the last suggestion, for Christina bore him 3 further children after her second marriage. But for the rest, he was adamant. Marguerite and her mother, he wrote, would rather be torn to pieces than incur such dishonor. And it looks like here's the quote. We are willing to reply as long as it is possible in dubious and ambiguous terms, but to say that there is no marriage, that advice should be given to another and not to us. We cannot and will not lie, for lying does nobody any good. And besides, to show that he too knew his Bible, God has forbidden false witness. Interesting quote there from Philip. In his rejection of the idea of basically lowering his second wife to the status of a concubine in order to basically bring peace to the entire German establishment, where it had been, it had been divided, of course, between Protestantism and Catholicism. Catholics were seizing upon this as a morbid, it was a wrong thing in their mind. Continuing on, the only effect of the sterile round of letters was to cause mounting irritation all around. Philip decided the one hope of breaking out of the impasse was to meet around a table and thrash out the disagreements. And at his request, delegates from himself and the elector met with Luther, at the Eisenach conference and battled over the issue for 4 whole days. That's the 15th to the 19th of July. Any hope of agreement soon faded. Luther upbraided the Hessians for having revealed the details of the marriage, which Philip's men indignantly denied. The dispensation, Luther went on, was valid only for the Landgrave's conscience and ceased to have meaning if it became known. A private yes signified a public no. Hence, if the news of the deliberation leaked out, he would deny its existence. He would not accept the view that what was right in God's eyes was automatically right in itself. For instance, a child by a man other than the husband must be regarded as the legitimate heir. Reader's note, so basically Luther was backtracking, and perhaps he was caught unaware. Remember that he did not know that this woman was of, she was of the lordship. She was of the higher estate. And it maybe he felt that, maybe he assumed that this was a lower estate woman that was be taken as a second wife. And therefore it could be more easily,
explained. And so this is a lot of quite an interesting situation here. The Luther then backtracks vociferously on this, simply because he did not want the Protestant movement to cause, to have the disrepute, even though it was an unfair disrepute. I say that again. It was an unfair disrepute because what Philip Landgrave was doing was correct according to Holy Writ. And remember that the Protestants believed in the concept of sola scriptura, which is Scripture alone. They rejected the idea the Catholics had, which, of course, was something akin to democratic principle, and then those democratic principles being ultimately arbitrated by one man, that being the Pope. Whether it agreed with Scripture or not. Continuing on. As statesmen of the church, Reformer dwelt on the disastrous consequences of public defense of bigamy. Most of Lutheran clergy and all the Calvinists were opposed root and branch to it. If he were known to have countenanced it, however discreetly, the Protestant church would be rent by a schism. And if he were to defend his action in writing, the results would be even more appalling. Quite apart from the pure ecclesiastical aspects of the case, the rules of public morality could not be flouted. If they were, the whole empire would collapse in anarchy. More concretely, the emperor would intervene, and Philip, discredited by his unorthodox marriage, would see his army melt like snow. Luther therefore made no bones about calling on Philip to, quote, tell a good strong lie, quote unquote, for the sake of the church. If the emperor was to question him, the Landgrave should reply that he did indeed have a concubine, and that he was willing to send her away if all the other princes with a similar attachment would do the same. Isn't that interesting? Readers know. So isn't that something that, because all of these princes had concubines. These guys, come on. They had a bunch of them probably. Continuing on, if Philip were really determined to publish the deliberation, he, Luther, would take the whole blame on himself and admit that he had blundered. But this was a counsel of desperation. The elector's men were equally forthright. The Landgrave's action they maintained was against God and public morality. He could not be defended. Let me read that again. The Landgrave's action they maintained was against God and public morality and could not be defended. However close the links between Hesse and Saxony, Philip would have liked to have submitted his case to a general council of the Protestant movement in Germany and asked the other princes to guarantee him protection until judgment had been given. But the elector was afraid, and with good reason, that Philip would use any such assurance to force the issue into the open and thus involve the Saxons in what had every appearance of being a major war, and one fought on very dubious grounds. The Landgrave, for his part, was just an intransigent. In other words, readers know he's basically saying that this was sort of something that didn't happen very often. It just happened. It was just an uncommon occurrence, and that it could be overlooked perhaps if he were to downgrade the second wife as a concubine. In a letter dated 18th July to his delegates, he expressed bitter appointment with the inconstancy of Luther and the elector. He realized that Luther is a contrary character who digs in his toes, and more, one contradicts him. He therefore counsels moderation in dealing with the informer, but he himself tackles the reformers vigorously in some of their arguments and to considerable effect. He is accused of having an affair with Marguerite before he married her. He flatly denies the charge. He is asked why he chose Marguerite and not another, as if his love for Marguerite were the cause and not the occasion of the bigamy. Now, readers note now why this is the crux of the thing. We're dealing with the lordly class versus commoners. It would have been overlooked if she was a commoner, because commoners are given to immorality. And they were given a certain extra dispensation, you see, in the mind of the lordly class, the nobles. And so it could have been easily overlooked if she was a common girl. And that was the main thing. It seemed to be sticking point. You look at the variation of the level of societal standing and how morality seemed to be the expectations of the lordly class, that being the nobility. Basically, they were held to a higher standard of sorts, except for on the occasion when they would take these mistresses. You see, the lower class were not allowed to do such, but to officially do this, it would be a greater offense because they have public exposure, you see, rather than say, let's say, a commoner who just happened to take a couple women and say, hey, these are my wives, you see. Continuing on, he points out that he could easily have had any other girl from the aristocracy on the same conditions, and he agreed that he married Marguerite because he was fond of her, but he says, I see that you holy people also take those you fancy. Had he been allowed to follow his inclinations in his first marriage, the whole debacle might have been avoided. Reader's note here. It's interesting that they say, well, he could have easily had any other girl from the aristocracy. Perhaps maybe she could have been cowed. Maybe what he's saying here is she could have been cowed into staying quiet about the relationship. But Marguerite, it appears, and her relatives in particular, were absolutely unwilling to be cowed, to keep the affair quiet, and to publicly present it as a different type of relationship. They wanted to shout it from the hilltops, obviously, such that her reputation might be damaged. That she would not be seen as a concubine, but rather as a full, unfettered wife with all rights and privileges as such. Continuing on. He points out that he could easily have had any girl from the aristocracy on the same conditions, and he agrees that he married Marguerite because he was fond of her, but he says, I see that you holy people also take those you fancy. Had he been allowed to follow his inclinations in their first marriage, the whole debacle might have been avoided. But the central argument is one advanced by John of Leyden. Better several wives than several whores, quote unquote. He had been repeatedly urged to desist from immorality, but the whole point of the marriage was to enable him to stop fornicating. Had he taken another whore, he would have been left in peace. But because he fell in love with a girl and married her, he is being hounded and deserted. How can he be pilloried for following the example of the patriarchs, including the pious Abraham? He realized that his conduct may cause offense, but he was not prepared to spare others' feelings at the cost of their own salvation. Oh, would to God, he cries Luther, that you and your colleagues would chastise such vices as adultery and drunkenness, not merely in word and speech, but also in fact. He is horrified at the prospect of Luther revoking the deliberation. Quote, oh God, dear Dr. Luther, he writes, what are we coming to when excellent people suffer a falling off for fear of other scholars, and even unto the world? If you can answer for the marriage about God, why such fears regards the world? His action was Christian, and if the theologians think otherwise, he should not have lent it in their moral sanction by attending the ceremony. Interesting. Reader's note here. Yeah, that's an interesting point here that he's saying. And remember, this is a very wise, and he's a little snaky, isn't he, in the way he does things, which I suppose certain princes are apt to do. But the idea is that Luther and Melanchthon were hornswoggled into this situation because they were not given the full information. And the very fact they were there lends credence to his claim that, see, they are there, they're attending my marriage, therefore they are giving their permission. Continuing on. The most he will promise to maintain his previous line of equivocation, but he will not lie. Let them crucify him if they will. If the situation becomes intolerable, he will publish the deliberation and fight for what he regards as a perfectly legitimate marriage. As for the elector, his delegates should be informed that he, Philip, will no longer act as a captain of the Protestant cause, and that they should withdraw from all negotiations with France for a grand alliance against the emperor and take precipitate leave, pretexting urgent business at home. The break was complete, although appearances were saved. The Eisenach Conference marked a turning point in Philip's relations with the Protestant movement. He had always threatened to turn to the emperor if his brothers in the faith refused to stand by him. Now they had abandoned him. In July, probably immediately after he learned of the result of the conference, he drafted a plan of reconciliation. In September, it was put into effect. Negotiations between the Landgrave's ambassadors and the imperial secretary dragged on till at last, in January of the following year, Philip demanded a straight reply to the proposals and obtained on the 24th of that month a written pardon from the emperor and a safe conduct to the imperial diet at Regensburg, for which he set out on the 1st of February. In return, he made a number of far-reaching political concessions. Under the terms of the agreement, Philip undertook to exclude France and any other non-German power from the Protestant alliance, the League of, it looks like, Smalkalden. This move decisively altered the balance of power in Europe in favor of the emperor. And most historians trace the decline of Protestantism as a political force in Europe back to this agreement. Reader's note, isn't that fascinating? That because Luther and Melanchthon and all of the Protestant rulers did not have, pardon the expression, the stones to stand behind this man, it caused the decline of the entire movement. Think about the implications of that and handed basically Europe back to the Pope. Continuing on. Though defection was not the end of Luther's troubles, the bigamy offered Catholic pamphleteers too good an opportunity of ridiculing and vilifying their opponents, and a steady stream of scurrility poured out, attacking Philip in his monstrous ways, quote unquote. The Landgrave, with his militant convictions, could not resist the urge to reply. For his defense, he turned to his specialist on polygamy, an ex-Carthusian called Lenin. Readers know, isn't that interesting that this guy had somebody who was extremely studied in marriage law and Holy Writ, undoubtedly, certainly not a Catholic in his leanings, it seems. Continuing on, this preacher had already composed more than a score of briefs on the subject, including 15 for the Eisenach Conference and several to set Marguerite's conscience at ease. He is not reported as having actually put his theories in practice, but for him, monogamy was far from monotonous. He maltreated his first wife, and then, when her sufferings were ended, married at the ripe age of 81 one of Marguerite's maids. In response to this latest appeal by Philip, Lenin surpassed himself and produced what is the first full-scale apologia for polygamy in Europe as Dialogus Neubuli, which, despite its Latin title, was written in German. Philip meant to ensure that his point of view was placed within the reach of the literate public and not just of a learned elite. Readers note here, isn't that interesting? Wouldn't it be great to get a hold of that? I wonder if that document is even available. Wouldn't that be something if we could get that document in English? And then, I'd be happy to read it for the YouTube public. Let's continue on. The book is, as the title indicates, in the form of a discussion between a supporter of plural marriage and an opponent. It is a remarkable work. In spite of its involved sentences and repetition mode of argument, says one critic, the dialogue is written with great skill so as to make bigamy, or rather polygamy, appear not only right, but, if that is admitted, attractive. The work is far too long to analyze. The essence of the argument is that polygamy is not contrary to divine, natural, canonical, or imperial law. Opposition to it has come solely from a perverted view of marriage as something evil in itself, and a desire to be holier than God himself. Polygamy, Lenin concludes, would alleviate the prevailing immorality and help to drive back the Turks, who were then pressing into the southeast flank of Europe. Polygamy was not, of course, to be made obligatory. It was only for those who felt a calling, as men in the Middle Ages had responded to a vocation for celibacy. Readers note, of course, this wasn't just, this was sort of an unfair characterization because the church basically at that time had instituted the doctrine of celibacy for the priesthood anyway. Continuing on, the book is referred to Bucer for his comments, and he not only examined it, but corrected and improved it a little, as he admitted. Indeed, as late as 1900, he was credited with having written it. He did, however, try to restrain the Landgrave from publishing it, but the most that he could achieve was that the work be distributed privately in mid-August 1541. Let me see here. We've got a discrepancy of dates here. The book was referred to Bucer for his comment, and he not only examined it, but corrected and improved it a little, as he admitted. Indeed, as late as 1900, he was credited with. Okay, so basically what the author is saying here is that copies of this have passed. So this then presupposes that perhaps there is a copy. I mean, 1900, that's not, too far from us. But initially, what came out in 1541. Of course, you think about, almost 400 years or so years, that this book was around. It must have made rounds among the elite, certainly. Continuing on, for Philip's missionary zeal in the cause of polygamy was unabated. He took the clergy to task for faint-heartedness when they remonstrated with him. If, he wrote to Melanchthon, we, you, Luther, and others suffered death, yet there will be found people who are more godly and trusting than we, who will accept this solution, which is not forbidden by God and is free and permissible. Far from contemplating martyrdom in the case of polygamy, the Lutheran clergy was outraged at Lenin's book. Luther had to persuade a friend of his, Justus Minius, to hold back a counterblast to the dialogue, but Luther himself cascaded the author as a garrulous fool. He also composed a refutation of which one of the milder passages reads, "Whoever follows this idiot in his book and thereupon takes more than one wedded wife and desires his action to be regarded as righteous, may the devil bury him in the abyss of hell." Readers note. So it appears that Luther, this is interesting history because, I had time, the dispensation that is often cited as Luther giving to Prince Philip of Hesse the Landgrave of Hesse, from his standpoint, he was tricked into such. Or, given the political intrigue, he didn't know all the details enough in order to make an informed decision. Therefore, he showed up at the marriage of the second wife, and it caused quite a stir and a problem for Luther. But Luther apparently backtracked. And like I said before, if Luther had had the stones, along with the other Protestant reformers, and had backed up this Lord, the Protestant Reformation would have been far more powerful, I believe. But because they lost Philip of Hesse to the Catholics, they lost their they lost the oomph, so to speak, of the movement. And they lost the. They looked as perhaps they were double-minded. And a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, and so, this regarded poorly in the eyes of the people. Continuing on, but Luther in his turn was restrained by the elector from publishing his work, and after a long estrangement, Philip and the reformers finally met. The discussion was remarkably cordial. Luther merely criticized Lenning's book for having used too many arguments of unequal force rather than a few really sound ones, and Luther and Philip thereupon withdrew as many copies of the dialogue from circulation as he could. Somehow the wounds healed and the scandal died down. An open break between the Landgrave and the Protestant church was avoided. Interesting. And the issue of polygamy was shelved. Okay, so basically what it's saying here is that the Landgrave, Philip of Hesse, eventually at the very end of it decided to treat kindly the Protestant Reformation, Protestant churches. But for a while it was quite a political hot potato, wasn't it? The fact that Philip soon afterwards took his troops into battle for the Protestant cause and suffered defeat and imprisonment at the hands of the emperor no doubt helped to reconcile the former hostile allies. It was not till well on his 17th century that the Wittenberg Deliberation and other documents on the bigamy were published. They were promptly seized on by the great French Catholic controversialist Bossuet. It looks like Bossuet, and used to devastating effect in his variations of the Protestant Church, 1688. Nowadays, the whole episode leaves most readers unmoved, if not unamused. Old Testament polygamy has long ceased to be of interest, and Philip's bigamy is mainly interesting as an illustration of the eternal conflict between the Crusaders, who put principles above everything else, and the realist, who lets practical considerations weigh heavily on the scales. But if Luther showed great statesman-like quality in his handling of the affair, it is Philip who comes out of it most credibly if the moral issues alone are examined. In other words, the idea, reader's note here, that Philip had the stones and take what may. He was going to stand by his absolute belief that he had taken this second wife righteously according to Holy Writ. But Luther and these Protestant reformers were really looked upon as simps because they backed away whenever the heat got too hot, you see. And so all of this ensued. Continuing on, he had scored a very shrewd hit by insisting on the revolutionary character of priestly marriage introduced by the Reformation. If, he asked, if it should suddenly be possible to overthrow such a firmly established institution as the celibacy of the clergy, why should the institution of bigamy be a priori excluded? Readers note, interesting statement. You look at all these arguments, and they're arguments perhaps that are bandied about today. The Catholics, obviously, once you read the scriptures, especially the New Testament, you can see the Catholics were clearly wrong, that it was a doctrine of demons to forbid men to marry, even if it was in the context of monogamy. And they had done so for the Catholic priests, and of course, pedastry, which even continues today, regrettably, in the Catholic Church, is the unavoidable effect of such. Continuing on. The only effective answer would have been the polygamy is condemned by Christian doctrine. This is the reply which most Protestant thinkers, such as Calvin, would have given to Philip's petition, and the prince would then have been stamped unequivocally as a radical or a heretic. But this was a stand that Luther and his colleagues never took, and for very good reasons. They could not. They themselves did not believe that polygamy was against divine or natural law. They took their stand solely on the grounds of expediency, you see, because it was politically incorrect. Luther, it is true, had curious views on a number of subjects, including sex. Had God consulted me, he wrote, I would have advised him to propagate the species by fashioning human beings out of clay the way Adam was created. However, sexual activity was an essential part of life, though sinful, like eating and drinking. Luther even alleged that Jesus had probably committed adultery with Mary Magdalene and other women in order to partake fully of the nature of man. Oh my goodness! Now these are the beliefs of Luther. There actually is an entire group of people in Europe that believe that Mary Magdalene that actually what they believe is that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and took her, and that Mary Magdalene was not the whore as the Catholic Church has painted her, but that she was a righteous woman. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Continuing on. But the main reason for his indulgence to polygamy had little direct connection with sex. His attitude stemmed from a problem that had faced the church from the beginning: how to defend certain acts of the patriarchs which were of questionable morality when judged by Christian ethics. The Manichaeans, early Christian sect, for example, had it laid down that Abraham was not a Christian since he was guilty of sensuality in his conjugal relations. St. Augustine immediately sprang to his defense. Abraham, he argued, had lived more chastely with his several wives than most men in monogamy, and in any case, polygamy in his life was the custom, and hence no sin. Luther took the same line. For him, Abraham was the first Christian, and more important than all the popes together. His morals had to be stoutly defended, and so right from the start, Luther lays it down that polygamy is not wrong in itself and definitely preferable to divorce. He was never to diverge from his position. He had frequent occasion to pronounce on the question himself. Early in 1525, a pastor called Karlstadt sponsored a request from one of his congregation for permission to take a second wife, since his first one was a leper. Luther replied that the man's confessor must first give his permission. He himself could not forbid such a marriage, but he would not advise it either. What was permissible must often be sacrificed for the general good. In 1526, Philip, who was even then looking for a way out of his marriage troubles, asked Luther whether polygamy was permissible in principle. The reply ran that no Christian should have more than one wife because that would give offense, and because there were no positive word from God suggesting that polygamy be revived. Heathens and Turks might do as they pleased. True, some of the patriarchs had been polygamists, but it was because they had a definite reason, such as the need for progeny. A Christian, before adopting polygamy, must first have a calling from God. Plural marriages, therefore, were to be rejected, except in the case of extreme need. Philip did not insist, and the matter was dropped for the time being. A little later, Luther admitted, contrary to the doctrine of the Catholic Church, that polygamous converts had been admitted into the early church. His convictions were put to the test when in 1531 he was asked by one of Henry VIII's agents whether that king could regard his marriage with Catherine of Aragon as void, the annulments of his marriage being an essential precondition of wedding Anne Boleyn and having a male heir. Most of the theological authorities consulted, many for interesting reasons, agreed that he could repudiate his queen. Let me read that again. This is about Henry VIII. His convictions were put to the test when in 1531 he was asked by one of Henry VIII's agents whether that king could regard his marriage with Catherine of Aragon as void, the annulment of his marriage being an essential precondition of wedding Anne Boleyn and having a male heir. Most of the theological authorities consulted, many for interested reasons, agreed that he could repudiate his queen. Luther, as well as Bucer and Melanchthon, took the opposite view and advised him to keep Catherine but take a second wife. I would allow the king, wrote Luther, to take another queen in accordance with the examples of the patriarchs of old, who had two wives at the same time, unquote. Readers note, isn't that interesting that the whole reason for backtracking on this on the part of Luther and Melanchthon and these Protestant leaders is simply for political expediency. It had nothing to do with what the Bible actually says. And this is a very interesting thing. But when pressed upon it, they did back it as long as it did not have political consequence. After all, who's going to tell the king of England what to do, you see? Who's going to stand against him? Continuing on. Melanchthon was equally favored to this course. Henry opined could try to obtain a male heir without any peril to his conscience or to anyone else by a second marriage. He would not, however, concede polygamy to all. And he added the piquant observation that the Pope would, in his view, accord the necessary dispensation as an act of love, unquote. If such permissions were refused, Henry should disregard the Pope's ban and take a second wife notwithstanding. Bucer joined his voice to those of his fellow reformers. Bigamy, which had been practiced by the patriarchs, could not be denied to Christians in modern times. It was in accordance with the law of Moses and did not offend against decency. Philip was well aware that these pronouncements formed a very strong card in his hand. His brief to Bucer goes over the familiar biblical propositions for which he was certain Luther could not dissent. There were the patriarchs who walked unreproved for their numerous wives with God, the absence of a ban on polygamy in the New Testament, despite the long list of things forbidden to new converts, the injunctions in Timothy had a bishop should have only one wife, and hence that others might have more. And later he was to draw the conclusion from the situation as to early converts. If it is possible for a Christian to keep his many wives, a man can be a Christian and take more than one wife, unquote. He makes effective play with the reformers' opinions on Henry VIII's submission. If that king could be allowed a second marriage, why not he? Admittedly, Henry needed a male heir to avoid civil war, but he, Philip, would suffer damnation unless he was helped to put a stop to his sins by a second marriage. And were not spiritual matters more deserving of care than mere worldly issues such as the stability of the English government? Readers note, that's interesting. A lot of these decisions were pragmatic, and so it had to do with the reasoning for taking a second wife. And it appears that they regarded it much more kindly if it so be that the absence of a male heir would cause a civil war, rather than perhaps in the case of Prince Philip Landgrave, that, he already had many children with the first wife. And this is an interesting thing, just for my own personal knowledge, that I had no idea about that in specific, but obviously that adds another dimension of understanding to the whole situation. But apparently, as I said, Henry would have been, because he had no male heir, therefore the war is considered a horrible evil. Therefore, it was a much greater evil than perhaps allowing him to take a second wife and in good standing. And so when Bucer learned of the Landgrave's proposal, he found it difficult to resist, not only on political but also on theological grounds. The reformers subjected himself to a long examination of conscience, the results of which are recorded in a work not published till 1878, which sets out the arguments for polygamy and those against. The nub of this exhaustive dissertation is that polygamy should be left to the individual conscience. Like marriage, it is a remedy against fornication. Each case must be judged according to its need, and for Bucer there was little doubt, in the light of Philip's sad tale of spiritual and physical woes, that the Landgrave's need was real and justified. Luther and Melanchthon were equally vulnerable to Philip's theological arguments. They were in the dilemma where the poor heart would fain deny, but dare not. The agonies stemming from their hesitation are visible at almost every turn in the Wittenberg deliberation. The document agrees that polygamy, though inferior to the ideal of monogamy laid down in the Bible, was allowed under the Mosaic law and was not forbidden in the New Testament. Readers note, isn't that interesting? That on the face of the New Testament, they had to agree it was not forbidden. Continuing on, it is permissible in the case of a man with a leper wife or of a captive who badly needs to be looked after, or of a captive who badly needs to be looked after, provided that the approval of the confessor is forthcoming. Therefore, a dispensation may also be given in the case of extreme need. But all this does not alter the rule of outward life, and there can be no question of a general introduction of bigamy. Hence, to avoid offense, the dispensation in Philip's case must be secret. Small wonder that Luther found it difficult to defend his position at the Eisenach conference. All he could muster by way of theological argument was that his earlier writings should not be regarded as infallible, and that he was learning every day. Who could say that he would change next in his theories? Paul had said, "Let every man have his own wife," and there was no examples of polygamy in the New Testament. Luther was usually more cogent than this. Readers note, actually, this is somewhat of a disingenuous position on the part of Luther. Yes, there's nothing specifically noted, but that does not, the absence of evidence is not proof that there wasn't this practice. And by historical documents, we can say that there absolutely was cases of polygamy in the early church before the Catholics took total control of Europe. And that you'll have to look that up, and I think we could supply that if you ask us. Continuing on, the truth is that the deliberation was taken on political, not doctrinal grounds, and Luther knew it. The same considerations had prevailed when he advised Henry VIII to take another wife, though his horror of divorce was genuine enough. The approval, as he was later to put it, was accorded because bigamy was more tolerable. Let me read that again. The approval, as he was later to put it, was accorded because bigamy was more tolerable than a situation in which both country and people would be torn asunder in civil war. Luther was at that point in time not so concerned about the possible extension of bigamy to lower orders. The Munsterite rebellion lay in the future. And besides, England was a foreign country, and a Catholic one at that, since Henry had not yet broken with the Pope. So there was no danger of the king going over to the other side. For Bucer, political considerations, those of status in particular, were just as important as for Luther. Latitude for bigamy, he wrote, as the scriptures show, is accorded more generously to kings than to others, and hence should be refused, least to all to great lords, unquote. The decision was political too in Philip's case. If he were not given his way, he could defect to the emperor and work against the Reformation. It was, said Luther, an emergency that could only be patched up with the help of Moses, the Mosaic Law. But the threat was a serious one only because of the Landgrave's power and rank. Luther was far less forthcoming to the anonymous but humble petitioner of 1525, afflicted with a leper wife. Readers know, isn't that something? So basically, and remember that a lot of these men who had rose to this position, might makes right. It depends on who they're allowed to have a biblical right. You see, it all depends on who. If they have might, if they have prestige and power, then these men will give their dispensation, allow such. Although it was somewhat on a very shaky ground with Prince Philip of Landgrave. Continuing on. Conversely, he was shocked to learn that Philip had committed bigamy with a lady-in-waiting, not a simple peasant girl. There is no need to veil one's face at the reformer's recognition of the power of social hierarchy in the 16th century. He was merely taking account, as any statesman should, of the dominant forces at work. In particular, he dreaded the impact of a bigamous marriage contracted by someone of Philip's standing. The actions of princes, quoted the deliberation rightly, caused more of a stir than those of private persons. Others, down to the veriest clodhopper, would seek to copy such a prestigious example. There is no mystery as to the ideas guiding Luther's policy in the whole affair. He was obsessed by the danger to social stability inherent in peasant revolts such as the risings of the 20s, when he had urged on the German rulers to hunt down the mad dogs and suppress the revolt in a river of blood. And more recently, and even more pertinently, there was the visionary Munsterite kingdom, which polygamy had formed a diabolical adjunct to the wildest social radicalism. If, as Bucer explicitly feared, population agitation were to find leaders in the nobles eager to introduce polygamy, a match would be set to a powder barrel, which might blow up the whole of Germany. And had Bucer's nightmare men realized, the whole evolution of European mores would have been utterly different. And that completes the chapter and completes our reading for today.